A message from his former security guard changed everything. Attached was a news article about Franklin Cobb, the man who cooked free meals for Shaq's team back in 2009. His cooking class was about to shut down. Shaquille O'Neal knew he had to give something back. On a damp Wednesday evening, he quietly visited an aging community kitchen in a working-class neighborhood of Houston. The problem was easy to see. After the area was redeveloped, the rent jumped from $900 to $2,400 a month. The increase left the 73-year-old cook with no way forward. To save the class, Shaq launched a secret mission. He joined as a student and blended in with the group. He wanted to see the truth for himself before making a move. What he found led to an unexpected training partnership with 5 guys. But the road ahead was far from easy. He faced strict city health rules, tough franchise requirements, and distrust from local street kids. Even with quiet help from a trusted assistant, every step became a challenge. Could Shaq save the kitchen before the eviction order took effect? The old wooden door creaked open at 7:10 that night. Shaquille O'Neal had to bend his back just to step through it. He stood 7 feet 1 inch tall and weighed 325 pounds. He kept his shoulders pulled in tight, the way he always did in small rooms. A single light bulb swung above his head on a frayed cord, throwing shadows across the cracked walls. He moved slow and quiet toward a red plastic chair in the back corner. The chair groaned under his weight, but it held. He wore a plain gray hoodie, with the hood pulled halfway up. No logo, no name, nothing to give him away. Underneath the hoodie, he wore old sneakers 2 sizes too small, just to look like everyone else. He had practiced this walk in his mirror. That morning, shoulders curled, steps small and slow. In front of him, 8 kids sat around a long steel table, elbows resting on cool metal. An old man stood at the head of it, sleeves rolled up past his elbows. This was Franklin Cobb, 73 years old, with hands like worn leather gloves. He had run this little class for almost 10 years, asking nothing from anyone. He kept a small wooden box by the stove, full of notes from old students who had moved on. He was showing the kids how to break down a whole chicken without wasting a single piece. Every part of this bird feeds somebody, Franklin said. Don't you forget that. The chicken cost $4.12. Franklin made sure everyone knew the price. He believed kids learned faster when they understood the real cost of things. Out there, this bird costs you a whole day's pay, he said. In here, it costs you attention. The kids laughed quietly, but they leaned in closer to watch his hands move. Shaq watched from the shadows, saying nothing, his huge knees pressed against the underside of the table. Nobody in that room had any idea who he really was. To them, he was just a quiet, oversized man who showed up that night to learn how to cook. He kept his eyes on Franklin's hands, on the careful way the old man worked the knife. There was something steady about this place, something that felt earned, not given. The smell of garlic and chicken fat filled the small kitchen, warm against the cold night air. Outside, rain tapped softly against a cracked window, steady like a clock. A boy at the far end of the table dropped his knife, embarrassed, and Franklin just smiled. Pick it up, try again, Franklin said. Nobody learns nothing the first time. For the first time in a long while, Shaq felt like he was somewhere real. He thought about all the kitchens he had walked through in his life, big and shiny and empty. None of them had felt like this one. He noticed a faded photo taped above the stove, showing a much younger Franklin in a different kitchen. He wondered what story sat behind that photo, but he kept the question to himself for now. Across the table, a younger girl named Destiny struggled to hold her knife the right way. Franklin walked over, without judgment, and gently adjusted her grip, finger by finger. Slow hands make fast cooks, he told her. Don't rush what your fingers don't know yet. Destiny nodded, focused now, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration. Shaq watched the small moment and felt something warm settle in his chest. This was nothing like the loud locker rooms and crowded arenas he had spent his life inside. Here, the only roar came from a pot of chicken stock simmering low on the back burner. A boy named Marcus, maybe 15 years old, raised his hand and asked why bones mattered at all. Bones make the stock, Franklin answered. Stock makes the soup taste like somebody cared. He poured a small cup for each student to taste, watching their faces light up with surprise. "See," he said, smiling. "Cheap bones, real flavor. Don't ever let anybody tell you cheap means worthless." Shaq sipped quietly from his own cup, the warm broth settling something restless inside him. At 10:45 that night, heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway outside. The sound was sharp and confident, like expensive shoes on tile. A man in a dark gray suit stepped into the room without knocking. His name was Trenton Sterling, and he worked for a real estate company called Apex Landmark. His face was calm, but his eyes were cold, scanning the room like he already owned it. He carried a thin folder under one arm like a weapon. "Mr. Cobb," he said, his voice smooth and polite. "We need to talk about the lease." Franklin wiped his hands on his apron and stepped forward, his back straight despite his age. Sterling opened the folder and laid a red notice on the counter, right next to the cutting board. It was an eviction notice, printed in bold black letters. "Rent is now $2,400 a month," Sterling said. "You're behind on the difference. That comes to $4,800. The kids in the room went silent. Tarek, 19 years old, clenched his fists under the table. "You have 10 days, Sterling continued. "Pay the balance, or clear out the equipment. This building is becoming a French restaurant next month," he added. "Progress doesn't wait." Franklin didn't argue. He just nodded slowly, like a man who had heard bad news before. But his eyes told a different story. Years of quiet pride sat behind them. One of the younger girls in the class started to cry softly, and Franklin reached over to pat her shoulder. "Hush now," he told her. "Crying don't season a meal. Eyes up." Sterling glanced around the room one more time, his nose wrinkling slightly at the worn equipment. "Honestly," he said, almost to himself, this place was overdue for an upgrade anyway. Sterling had started his career sweeping floors for Apex Landmark 15 years earlier. He had clawed his way up by following every rule and questioning none of them. To him, the eviction wasn't cruelty. It was simply a number on a quarterly report. He genuinely believed progress meant clearing out anything that didn't turn a strong enough profit. That belief had cost him his patience for stories like Franklin's a long time ago. Sterling turned and walked out, his shoes clicking against the floor like a countdown. The door shut behind him, with a hollow bang that seemed to hang in the air. For a long moment, nobody in the room spoke. Shaq sat still in his corner chair, his jaw tight, watching Franklin's hands shake just slightly. He had seen men like Sterling before. Smooth talkers who never raised their voice and never showed mercy. Something in his chest started to burn, slow and steady, like a fire catching dry wood. Shaq's hand slipped into his pocket, where his wallet sat heavy and full. One phone call to his bank, and $4,800 would disappear like nothing. He could solve this in 30 seconds. He almost did. But then he looked at Tarek, whose hands were still shaking, with anger under the table. Tarek worked 3 jobs and stayed up most nights past 2 in the morning. He stacked boxes at a warehouse, washed dishes at a diner, and swept floors at a gas station. Some nights, he slept for only 3 hours before starting the whole cycle again. Shaq remembered another boy just like him, growing up poor in Newark years ago. That boy had once watched a stranger's charity turn his own mother's face red with shame. Lucille had refused free groceries from a church van more than once, even when the fridge was empty. "We don't take what we didn't earn," she used to say, standing tall in the doorway. Back then, charity always came with a price. People who took it felt smaller, not bigger. Shaq remembered standing in line once for a free turkey at Thanksgiving, only 9 years old. A photographer had asked his mother to smile for the local paper that day. Lucille had pulled Shaq close and walked away, without taking the turkey at all. "We'll figure something out," she told him on the walk home, her voice tight but proud. He never forgot the hunger of that night, or the strange comfort of his mother's pride. A quick check from a stranger would fix tonight's problem. It would not fix next month's. Sterling could raise the rent again in 30 days. He could find another reason to push them out. Real change needed something stronger than a check written in secret, late at night, by a stranger. Shaq pulled his hand back out of his pocket, empty. He didn't know the answer yet, but he knew writing a check wasn't it. The laws around city zoning were thick and slow to fight, full of pages no one read. For tonight, All he could do was sit in the silence and think. The rain outside grew heavier, drumming against the old tin roof like impatient fingers. 8 kids packed up their bags, without a word, their faces tired and tense. One by one, they slipped out into the wet night, hoods up, shoulders bent against the wind. Franklin stayed behind, moving slow between the tables, wiping down each one by hand. He hummed something low and old under his breath, a song from a church long since closed. When the room finally cleared out, Shaq stayed to help. He picked up a mop, without being asked, and started on the greasy floor. Franklin didn't know who this giant stranger was. He just smiled and handed him a second rag. "You've got a good reach on you," Franklin said, chuckling. "Bet you were good at basketball." Shaq just shrugged and kept working, careful not to give anything away. "Played a little, back in the day," he said, keeping his voice light. "Why do you do all this for free?" Shaq finally asked, his voice low. Franklin paused and looked out the foggy window toward the empty street. "Back in 2009, I cooked for some security guys working a big event downtown," he said. "Big stars walked right past those guys every night. Nobody ever looked at them twice. Those men stood for hours protecting people who never said thank you," Franklin said quietly. "I'd bring them plates of food on my own dime, just so somebody noticed they were tired. Somebody has to feed the ones standing in the back, holding everything up." Shaq stood still, the mop forgotten in his hand, water dripping slowly onto the tile. Those simple words hit him harder than any speech he had ever heard. He thought about every person who had ever guarded him, driven him, or carried his bags. He thought about how rarely he had stopped to really see them, to ask their names. Franklin wasn't asking for credit. He never once mentioned wanting anything back. "Don't you ever get tired of giving and getting nothing back?" Shaq asked. Franklin laughed, a short and tired sound. "Tired ain't the same as wrong, son. Besides," he added, "I got paid plenty. Just not in money." He told Shaq about losing his own restaurant years before the security job ever came along. A bank had foreclosed on it during a slow winter, leaving him with nothing but his knives. "Started teaching kids after that," Franklin said. "Figured if I couldn't run a kitchen, I'd build new ones." That was the moment Shaq understood his real mission. This was never just about saving a kitchen. This was about protecting the people nobody else bothered to protect. He finally had a reason strong enough to fight for, bigger than money, bigger than his own name. That night, inside a black SUV parked 2 blocks away, Shaq made a call. Sarah Jenkins, his longtime legal assistant, picked up on the second ring. "I need you to set up a meeting," Shaq said. "With Five Guys Corporate, fast." Sarah had worked with him for 6 years and rarely asked questions first. "What's the angle?" she asked, already pulling out her laptop in the middle of the night. "A real training program," Shaq said. "Paid jobs for kids who need a second chance." He explained Franklin's kitchen, the eviction notice, and the deadline ticking down. Sarah wrote fast, her pen scratching across a yellow legal pad balanced on her knee. 10 days isn't much time to build something like this," she said carefully. "Then we don't waste a single hour," Shaq answered. "You sure about this?" Sarah asked. "You usually stay out of the spotlight on things like this." "This isn't about the spotlight," Shaq said. "It's about a debt I never got to pay back." Sarah went quiet for a second, then said softly, "Most people wouldn't even remember a name from 2009. "I'm not most people," Shaq said. "And Franklin Cobb isn't just a name to me anymore." Sarah promised to reach the regional office in Houston by morning. Shaq leaned back against the leather seat and stared out at the rain-streaked window. For years, he had stayed quiet about his post-retirement life, avoiding cameras and attention. This plan would force him out of the shadows, at least with the people who mattered. He would have to sit through boring meetings, read thick contracts, and argue with strangers. There was a real risk, too. If this deal failed, it could embarrass everyone involved. But the image of Tarek's shaking fist stayed stuck in his mind. Some risks were worth taking, even for a man who already had everything. He texted Sarah one more line before the call ended. "Move fast. 10 days isn't long." The SUV pulled away from the curb, leaving the dark kitchen behind in the rain. Shaq had crossed a line that night. There was no walking it back now. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he saw Newark again, gray and cold, and far away. He remembered his stepfather, Philip Harrison, telling him that real strength never needed an audience. Quiet hands build the most, Philip used to say, tightening a bolt on an old car engine. Shaq had carried that lesson through every arena, every contract, every quiet night since retirement. Tonight, for the first time in years, he finally had a place to put it to use. 3 days later, Shaq returned to the kitchen, still pretending to be just another student. Tarek watched him, with narrow eyes, from across the room, arms crossed tight, over his chest. "You don't look like you belong here," Tarek said, his voice flat and guarded. "Nobody belongs anywhere, until they show up enough times," Shaq answered simply. Tarek didn't trust rich strangers, or strangers of any kind, after years of being let down. His own father had walked out, when he was 7, promising to come back soon. He never did, and Tarek had stopped waiting for anyone a long time ago. That night, the two of them were stuck scrubbing the grill long after the others left. Burnt grease clung to every metal bar, thick and stubborn under their fingers. Shaq worked without complaint, his huge hands scraping, until his knuckles started to bleed. Tarek noticed and slowed down, watching the giant stranger work just as hard as him. "Most folks like you don't stick around this long," Tarek finally admitted. "I'm not most folks," Shaq said, and left it right there. "You got a job, or you just got time to kill?" Tarek asked, half joking. "I had a job once," Shaq said. "Now I'm figuring out what comes after." "Must be nice," Tarek muttered. "Having time to figure stuff out." Shaq didn't answer that one. He just kept scrubbing, letting the silence sit between them. After a while, Tarek spoke again, quieter this time. "You ever get scared of starting over?" Shaq thought about it honestly before answering. "Every single day? Fear just means you still care." Tarek let that sit in the air, turning it over like a new tool in his hands. Something shifted between them that night. A small, quiet trust began to grow, but trouble was already creeping back toward the kitchen door. Sterling hadn't waited for the 10 days to run out. He returned the next morning, with a city health inspector named Vance walking beside him. Vance carried a clipboard and a flashlight, checking every corner, with sharp, quick eyes. "Standard inspection," Sterling said smoothly, though his smile gave away the real plan. He wanted violations. Any excuse to shut the place down early. Vance scribbled notes about an old stove and a cracked floor tile. He knelt down and ran a gloved finger along a seam in the floor, frowning. "This wiring looks original to the building," Vance muttered, half to himself. "That's a problem, right?" Sterling asked quickly, almost too eager. Vance shrugged. "It's old. Doesn't mean it's broken. I write what's actually wrong, not what's old." Sterling's jaw tightened, clearly hoping for a harsher verdict than the one he was getting. Franklin stood by silently, his jaw clenched tight, refusing to beg or argue. The kitchen had survived for years on patched pipes and careful habits. Now it was facing a fight on 2 fronts at once, both closing in fast. 5 days remained before the deadline when Sarah called with bad news. "Corporate said no," she told Shaq. "The kitchen fails their safety standards completely." 5 Guys required strict rules for fire safety and waste disposal in any partner location. Franklin's old kitchen had neither system updated in over a decade. There was a second problem too, one that hit even closer to home. Hiring kids with police records violated the company's insurance policy. Tarek had 1 arrest on his record from a fight 2 years earlier, pure self-defense. A man twice his size had grabbed his little sister's arm outside a corner store. Tarek had stepped in, and the police had only seen the end of the fight. On paper, that single arrest made him too risky to hire. Tarek never talked about it much, but the record followed him into every job application he filled out. Most managers tossed his resume the moment they saw the word assault listed in the background check. "They're treating it like numbers on a page," Shaq said, frustration creeping into his voice. "They don't see the kid. They just see the risk," Sarah replied gently. Shaq sat in silence for a long moment, staring at his phone, the screen glowing in the dark. The dream of a real partnership was crumbling before it even started. Every door he pushed seemed to lead straight into another locked one. He thought about walking away and just paying the rent himself, quietly, without anyone noticing. But Franklin's words about the people in the back kept echoing in his head. This deal wasn't just paperwork. It was a chance for kids like Tarek to matter. He told Sarah to push for one more meeting, no matter how small the odds. "Get me in front of whoever makes the final call," Shaq said. Sarah promised to try, though her voice carried real doubt. "They don't usually take meetings this fast," she warned him. "Make them," Shaq said quietly. The clock kept ticking, and the walls kept closing in. The video call connected at exactly 9 o'clock the next morning. Craig Foster, the regional operations director for Five Guys, appeared on the screen. He had a sharp suit and an even sharper, no-nonsense tone. "Dr. O'Neal," Foster said, using Shaq's honorary title with a hint of sarcasm. "Your brand is worth hundreds of millions. We can't risk our entire operating system for a group of unlicensed street kids," Foster said bluntly. "With respect, sir, these kids aren't a risk," Shaq said. "They're an investment nobody else made." Foster's face stayed flat, unmoved by the words. "Investments don't usually come with arrest records," Foster replied coolly. "Neither do they usually come with a $1 million guarantee," Shaq shot back evenly. Foster paused, clearly not expecting the conversation to turn this fast. Outside the kitchen, the sound of hammering suddenly echoed through the building. Sterling had sent workers to board up the windows with thick plywood, right on schedule. Tarek saw the workers through the glass and bolted for the door in a rage. He wanted to fight them, even if it meant landing right back in trouble with the law. Shaq moved fast, stepping between Tarek and the door before anything could happen. His huge frame blocked the chaos outside, calm and steady as stone. He placed one massive hand on Tarek's shoulder and held it there. "Answer, don't react," Shaq said quietly. The words landed like a closed door on Tarek's anger. Tarek's fists slowly loosened. He stepped back, breathing hard but staying put, his chest heaving. Shaq turned back to the screen, his voice steady despite everything happening around him. "I'll personally guarantee a $1 million insurance bond for every student in this program," he said. "I'll also pay to upgrade the entire kitchen within 48 hours out of my own pocket." Foster went quiet on the screen, clearly caught off guard by the offer. The hammering outside finally stopped. Even Sterling's men seemed to sense something had changed. Foster leaned back in his chair, studying the screen for a long, silent moment. "That's a serious number," Foster finally said. "Why would you put your own money on the line?" "Because somebody put a free meal in front of my team once and never asked for a thing," Shaq said. Foster rubbed his jaw, weighing the offer against every rule he had ever followed. He thought about the quarterly report waiting on his desk, full of numbers and no names. Then he thought about the simple math of one guaranteed $1 million against a small kitchen. Slowly, the rules in his head started losing the argument to the offer in front of him. "Send the paperwork," he said. "We'll review under those terms." It wasn't a full yes, but it was the first real crack in the wall. Sterling wasn't ready to lose that easily. That night, he came up with one final, dirty move. At midnight, he had the building's main water valve shut off completely. Then he chained the front door shut, claiming there was a sudden gas leak emergency. Without working water, the kitchen could never pass its safety inspection the next morning. Sarah called Shaq just after 1 a.m. with the news, her voice tight with worry. "If we don't have water by sunrise, the whole deal falls apart," she said. Shaq didn't hesitate. He called Tarek and Franklin and told them to meet him there immediately. Rain poured down hard as the small group gathered behind the locked building. Franklin arrived first, still in his bathrobe, his flashlight shaking slightly in his grip. "This building's been mine in spirit for 30 years, Franklin muttered. "I ain't losing it tonight." Tarek showed up next, hood soaked through, eyes wide awake despite the hour. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, already rolling up his sleeves. They found a narrow service tunnel underground, barely wide enough for a grown man to crawl through. Shaq, despite his massive size, dropped to his knees in the cold, dirty water. He squeezed his huge shoulders through the tight space, scraping skin against rusted metal pipes. Inside, the old plumbing system had cracked badly from years of neglect and pressure. Using nothing but a phone flashlight, Tarek worked fast to weld the broken pipe joints. His hands moved, with practiced care, steady despite the cold water soaking his jeans. Shaq held the heavy old pipe steady on his shoulders, bearing the full weight himself. Water dripped down his neck mixed with sweat, but he never once let go. Every few minutes, his back screamed in pain, but he stayed locked in place. Nobody spoke much. There was only the sound of rain, metal, and heavy breathing. A man worth $400 million knelt in filthy water at 3 in the morning. He did it for a kitchen that wasn't even his, for people the world rarely noticed. Franklin stood above the tunnel entrance, holding an umbrella over the opening, useless but determined. By 5 a.m., the pipes finally held, and clean water rushed back through the lines. Tarek sat back against the wall, soaked and shivering, and let out a tired laugh. "We actually did that," he said, almost in disbelief. "We did," Shaq said, wiping grime from his hands. "Now let's see if it holds." Franklin handed out 3 chipped mugs of hot coffee, his hands still trembling from the cold. "Whatever happens next," he said, "I won't forget you 3 showed up at 3 in the morning." Tarek managed a tired smile. "Beats my other jobs, I'll give you that much." For a moment, the exhausted group simply sat together, listening to the rain finally start to ease. At 8 a.m. sharp, Vance and Sterling arrived for the final inspection. Sterling wore a confident smile, sure the kitchen would fail without water. Instead, they found the taps running clean and strong, the floors scrubbed spotless. Every piece of equipment gleamed under the morning light, freshly upgraded overnight. Vance walked the room slowly, checking every corner with his clipboard. He turned a faucet on and off twice, almost suspicious of how well it worked. He checked the fire extinguisher tags, the cooler temperature, and the new floor drains. He found nothing wrong, not one single violation worth writing down. He signed the final health certificate right there on the counter without hesitation. Sterling's smile disappeared fast. He grabbed the old eviction notice off the wall in anger. "Fine, you passed inspection," Sterling snapped. "But Cobb still owes rent he can't pay." Just then, the front door opened, and a team of lawyers walked in beside Sarah. They handed Sterling a thick legal document, stamped and fully signed. Five Guys Corporate had just purchased the entire commercial block from Apex Landmark's parent company. Sterling's own employer no longer owned the building he was standing in. Five Guys was now the official landlord, and Sterling had been fired on the spot. He had broken company ethics rules by sabotaging the very deal his bosses approved. Sterling stood frozen, his mouth open, with nothing left to threaten anyone with. He looked around the room one last time, then turned and walked out, without a word. The plywood still hung crooked on the windows behind him as he left. Franklin stared around the room, stunned, slowly realizing his classroom finally had a permanent home. Tarek let out a breath he didn't know he was holding, relief flooding his face. Someone in the back started crying quietly, then laughing through the tears. The fight that almost crushed them had ended in their favor after all. Within weeks, the small classroom transformed into something much bigger. It became known as the Franklin Cobb Prep Academy, fully funded and fully equipped. Five Guys supplied brand new stoves, walk-in coolers, and proper safety systems throughout. Classes ran free for neighborhood kids during the day, before the restaurant's regular hours. In exchange, Five Guys gained a steady pipeline of well-trained, loyal new employees. Tarek became one of the very first graduates hired under the new program. He started his job earning $18.50 an hour, with full health coverage. For the first time in his life, he didn't have to work 3 jobs just to survive. He moved into a small apartment of his own, and finally slept through a full night. He even started saving a little money each week, something he had never been able to do. On weekends, he started teaching the newest students how to scrub a grill without wasting water. He never told them his story word for word, but they could feel it in how patient he was. Some nights, after class, he sat in the same red plastic chair Shaq once used. He never learned the giant stranger's real name, not until months after it was all over. Franklin stood proudly at the front of his new, fully equipped classroom. He still taught the same lesson about wasting nothing from a $4 chicken. New students filed in every week, drawn by word of mouth across the neighborhood. The little wooden box of old student notes finally got a shelf of its own. Destiny, the young girl, who once struggled with her knife grip, came back every single week. By the second month, she could break down a whole chicken faster than most of the older students. Franklin liked to joke that she would run the place herself in another 10 years. On the day of the official signing ceremony, reporters and cameras filled the room. Local news vans lined the street outside, and a small crowd gathered to watch. But the giant man, who started it all, was nowhere to be found. Shaq had already slipped out the back door before anyone could thank him publicly. On the kitchen counter, Franklin found a small, handwritten note left behind. It simply read, "Thanks for feeding my team back in '09. This kitchen is yours for good. S." Franklin held the note for a long time, his eyes wet, his hands steady. He folded it carefully and tucked it into his apron pocket, close to his chest. Outside, the Houston rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets clean and quiet. Somewhere in that city, a giant man walked alone, asking for nothing in return. He never wanted his name on the building or his face in the news. He only wanted the people who held everyone else up to finally feel held themselves. And somewhere on a busy street, he disappeared back into the crowd, just another tall stranger. Months later, a small plaque appeared by the academy's front door, simple and unsigned. It read only, "For the ones who hold everything up. Keep going." Nobody ever confirmed who paid for it, and nobody at the academy ever asked. Some debts, Shaq believed, were better paid quietly than announced out loud. Franklin kept Shaq's handwritten note framed behind the counter for the rest of his life. Every new student who joined the academy eventually asked about the small frame on the wall. Franklin always gave the same short answer, smiling like he held a secret worth keeping. "A friend left that," he would say. "The kind that shows up before you even know you need one." Then he would hand them a knife and a $4 chicken, and the lesson would begin again. This story is a work of fiction inspired by real-life kindness and second chances. Names, places, and events were created for storytelling purposes.